My son-in-law's hands were still dirty from throwing soil onto my wife's casket when he cornered me at her funeral reception and whispered the words that would change everything. "The money's mine now, old man. Sign it over, or I'll make sure you never see your grandchildren again." I was 67 years old. I'd just buried the love of my life. And in that moment, staring into the cold, calculating eyes of the man who'd married my daughter, I realized I was about to learn what real betrayal felt like. If you've ever felt the sting of family turning against you when you're at your lowest, if you've ever wondered how far someone would go for money, then you need to hear this story. Because what happened next? Well, let's just say revenge is a dish best served methodically. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear how a grieving widower took down the greediest man I've ever known. Trust me, you won't see this ending coming. Let me take you back to where this all began, because context matters when you're talking about the kind of money that makes people lose their souls. My name is Frank Morrison, and I spent 43 years married to a woman named Catherine, who was worth more than I could have ever imagined. Not just in spirit, though God knows she had plenty of that, but in cold, hard assets that would make your head spin. When I met Catherine in 1979, I was a 24-year-old auto mechanic with grease permanently embedded under my fingernails and dreams bigger than my bank account. She was 22, working as a secretary at Morrison Electronics, which, yes, happened to share my last name, though we weren't related. Her father, Gerald Morrison, had built that company from nothing into one of the largest electronics distributors on the West Coast. Catherine never acted like money mattered. She'd show up to our dates in her beat-up Honda Civic, insisting on splitting dinner bills, working overtime even though she didn't need to. I fell in love with her laugh first, this genuine, uninhibited sound that made everyone in a room turn and smile. Then I fell in love with her stubborn streak, the way she'd argue politics with anyone brave enough to engage, how she'd spend her Saturdays volunteering at the animal shelter despite being allergic to half the dogs there. We got married in 1981 in a small ceremony that her father barely attended. Gerald Morrison had made it clear he thought his daughter was marrying beneath her station. A grease monkey, he called me. Not to my face, but Catherine told me about his comments, how he'd tried to talk her out of the engagement, how he'd threatened to cut her off financially if she went through with it. She married me anyway. For the first 15 years of our marriage, we lived modestly. I opened my own garage, Morrison's Auto Repair. Yes, I kept my name on it, partly out of spite. Catherine worked part-time at a non-profit, raising money for literacy programs. We struggled some months, celebrated the good ones, and built something real together. Our daughter Emma was born in 1987. Catherine had complications during delivery, hemorrhaging that nearly cost us both of them. I'll never forget sitting in that hospital waiting room for 14 hours, praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in, making bargains I couldn't keep. When the doctor finally came out and told me they were both okay, I broke down right there in the hallway. Emma was everything Catherine was: fierce, intelligent, compassionate to a fault. She inherited her mother's laugh and, unfortunately, her grandfather's stubborn streak when it came to family expectations. Gerald Morrison died suddenly of a heart attack in 1996 when Emma was 9. That's when everything changed. I'll never forget the day Catherine came home from the lawyer's office, pale as winter, clutching a folder full of documents that would redefine our entire existence. Her father had left her everything, and I mean everything. Morrison Electronics, valued at $8 million at the time. Real estate holdings across 3 states. Investment portfolios that made my head spin. Stock options and bonds and assets I couldn't pronounce, let alone understand. $26 million. That's what the final tally came to after all the legal dust settled. Catherine cried for 2 weeks straight, not from joy, from guilt. She felt like she'd been living a lie, pretending to be something she wasn't. The money felt dirty to her, tainted by her father's disapproval and years of watching him prioritize business over family. We had long conversations about what to do with it. Catherine wanted to give most of it away, keep just enough for Emma's education and our retirement. But I convinced her to think bigger. We could use this money to build something meaningful, something that would honor her father's memory while reflecting her values. So that's what we did. We kept Morrison Electronics but transformed its mission. Instead of just distributing electronics, we started a division focused on providing technology to underserved schools. We funded literacy programs, supported small businesses in struggling communities, created scholarships for kids whose parents worked in trades, kids like I had been. The money grew. By 2010, our combined assets were worth over $40 million. By 2020, we were approaching $60 million. Catherine had a gift for strategic giving that somehow always seemed to multiply our resources instead of depleting them. But here's the thing about money that most people don't understand until they have it. It changes how everyone else sees you, even when you try to stay the same person. Emma grew up knowing she was wealthy, but never fully grasping what that meant. Catherine and I were careful about that. We made her work summer jobs, taught her to budget her allowance, insisted she earn her own spending money in high school. She went to public school, drove a used car, learned the value of $1 the way we had. Still, kids talk. Other parents whisper. By the time Emma was in college studying social work at Berkeley, a choice that made Catherine beam with pride, she was acutely aware that she was different from most of her peers. That's where she met Derek Castellano. I should have seen the red flags from day one. Actually, I did see them. I just didn't trust my instincts enough to act on them. Derek was a business major with an emphasis on finance, the kind of guy who wore expensive watches and talked constantly about market trends and investment opportunities. He was handsome in that polished, calculated way that probably worked on a lot of young women. Dark hair always perfectly styled, suits that fit too well for a college student, a smile that never quite reached his eyes. But Emma was smitten. She brought him home for Thanksgiving during her junior year, and I watched this kid spend the entire weekend cataloging our possessions with his eyes. He asked pointed questions about Catherine's work with Morrison Electronics, about our investment strategy, about our estate planning. 21 years old and talking like a financial advisor. Catherine was more diplomatic than I was. After Derek and Emma left, she sat me down in our kitchen and said she thought I was being too hard on him. Maybe he's just nervous, she said. Maybe he's trying to impress us by showing interest in our lives. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But something about Derek Castellano made my skin crawl from day one. They got engaged during Emma's senior year. Derek proposed with a ring that cost more than most people make in 6 months, which I know because he made sure to mention the price point during his asking for my blessing. The blessing conversation, by the way, was less about his love for Emma and more about his 5-year plan for maximizing our family's financial potential. I asked him point blank what he did for money, since he seemed to have plenty of it for a college student. Trust fund, he said, family money from his grandfather's construction business. He was vague about details, but Emma vouched for him, and Catherine reminded me that I'd been suspicious of Derek from the beginning simply because he wasn't what I'd pictured for our daughter. They married in 2011, 24 years old, both of them. The wedding cost more than my first house, though Catherine insisted on paying for everything. Derek's family was interesting. His parents were polite but distant, and there was something off about the way they talked about money. Lots of references to past wealth, to businesses that had been sold, to investments that hadn't panned out. I got the impression that Derek's trust fund might not be as substantial as he'd implied. But Emma was happy. That's what mattered to Catherine and me. Our daughter was radiant on her wedding day, completely in love with this man who seemed devoted to her. The first few years were good. Derek got a job at a financial services firm in San Francisco. Emma started her career as a social worker specializing in family counseling. They bought a nice house in Oakland, with help from us for the down payment, though Derek made sure everyone knew he'd qualified for the mortgage on his own. Emma got pregnant in 2014. Twin boys, Jacob and Michael. Catherine was over the moon about becoming a grandmother. She retired from active management of Morrison Electronics to focus on spoiling her grandsons and supporting Emma through the challenges of raising twins while working full-time. That's when I started noticing changes in Derek. It was subtle at first. Comments about how Emma didn't need to work since we could easily support them. Suggestions about investment opportunities that would really maximize Catherine's assets. Questions about our estate planning, our will, our long-term financial strategy. Derek started showing up to family dinners with folders full of financial projections. He'd corner Catherine with spreadsheets showing how different investment approaches could increase our wealth. He talked constantly about opportunity costs and market inefficiencies and tax optimization strategies. Catherine, bless her heart, thought he was just trying to be helpful. She appreciated that he was taking an interest in preserving the family's financial stability for Emma and the boys. I thought he was circling us like a vulture. The tension between Derek and me became harder to hide as the years went on. Emma started making excuses for why he couldn't attend certain family gatherings. Catherine would referee our interactions, trying to smooth over the obvious friction. But Derek was smart. He never crossed lines with Catherine present. He saved his real conversations for moments when he and I were alone. Like the time in 2018 when Catherine was upstairs bathing the boys, and Derek cornered me in the garage where I was working on an old Mustang I'd been restoring. "You know, Frank," he said, leaning against my workbench with that calculated casualness of his, "Catherine's not getting any younger. Have you guys thought about what happens to all this when she's gone?" I looked up from the engine I was rebuilding and stared at him. What the hell was that supposed to mean? Just thinking practically, he continued. Estate taxes can be brutal on assets this size. There are strategies we could implement now that would save the family millions down the road. I set down my wrench and turned to face him fully. "Derek," I said, "my wife is 61 years old and in perfect health. I'm not having conversations about her death." He held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just trying to look out for everyone's interest here. Emma and the boys are going to inherit all this someday, right? Wouldn't you want to make sure they get the maximum benefit?" That was Derek, always framing his greed as concern for others. By 2019, Derek had been promoted to senior account manager at his firm. His salary had increased substantially, but somehow their expenses always seemed to outpace his income. They needed help with the mortgage, then help with the boys' private school tuition, then help with a new car when Derek's lease expired. Catherine helped with all of it. She couldn't bear the thought of Emma struggling financially when we had more than enough to spare. I tried to talk to her about establishing boundaries. We were enabling Derek's increasingly expensive lifestyle, and I was worried about what message that sent to Emma and the boys. But Catherine saw it differently. "We're family, Frank," she'd say. "This is what the money is for, making sure our daughter and grandchildren are taken care of." In 2020, Derek approached us with what he called a business opportunity. A friend of his from college had developed some kind of app for cryptocurrency trading. Derek wanted us to invest $2 million as seed funding for this startup. He had a whole presentation prepared, charts and graphs and projections that showed astronomical returns. He talked about getting in on the ground floor of the next big thing, about how this investment could triple our money within 2 years. I took one look at his pitch and knew it was garbage. The app was barely functional. The friend was some guy Derek knew from a poker game. The whole thing reeked of desperation masked as opportunity. Catherine was more polite in her refusal than I would have been. She explained that our investment strategy was focused on long-term stability rather than high-risk ventures. She offered to connect Derek with some reputable financial advisors who might be able to help him find more suitable investment opportunities. Derek did not take the rejection well. That was the first time I saw his mask slip completely. The charming, professional facade cracked, and underneath I caught a glimpse of something ugly, something entitled and resentful and very, very angry. He accused us of not trusting him. He said we were holding Emma back by refusing to support her husband's career advancement. He implied that our decision was motivated by classism, that we looked down on him because he hadn't been born into money like Catherine. Emma was mortified. She apologized on Derek's behalf, explaining that he'd been under a lot of pressure at work, that he'd been counting on this investment opportunity to secure their financial future. But the damage was done. Something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic. Derek's resentment was now visible to everyone, and Emma was caught in the middle, trying to keep peace between the man she loved and the parents who had raised her. The next 2 years were increasingly tense. Derek became more brazen in his financial requests, and more bitter when we said no. He started making comments about our selfish hoarding of wealth that could be put to better use. He questioned our charitable giving, suggesting that we were wasting money on strangers while neglecting our own family. Meanwhile, Emma was struggling. The stress of mediating between Derek and us was taking its toll on her health and her relationship with the boys. She looked tired all the time. The joy that had always characterized my daughter was dimming, and I could see it breaking Catherine's heart. In early 2023, Catherine started experiencing what she initially dismissed as fatigue. She'd always been energetic, the kind of person who could work a 12-hour day and still have enthusiasm for an evening walk or a game with her grandsons. But suddenly she was napping in the afternoons, going to bed earlier, struggling to keep up with her usual pace. I insisted she see a doctor, then another doctor, then a specialist. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The diagnosis hit our family like a physical blow. Catherine had always been the strong one, the planner, the person who held everyone together. The idea that she might be vulnerable, might be mortal, was almost incomprehensible. The oncologist was honest about the prognosis. With aggressive treatment, Catherine might have 2 years. Without it, maybe 6 months. Catherine chose to fight. The next 18 months were a blur of chemotherapy and radiation, of good days and bad days, of hoping for miracles and preparing for the worst. Catherine faced her illness with the same grace and determination she'd brought to everything else in her life, but the treatments were brutal. She lost weight, lost her hair, lost pieces of herself that I'd never imagined could disappear. Through it all, Derek's behavior became increasingly erratic. On good days, when Catherine was feeling strong enough to attend family gatherings or take the boys to the park, Derek would be charming and attentive. He'd bring flowers, help with household tasks, play the role of devoted son-in-law perfectly. But on bad days, when Catherine was weak from treatment and I was exhausted from caregiving, Derek would show his true colors. He'd make comments about how expensive Catherine's medical care was becoming. He'd wonder aloud whether it was worth spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on treatments that might not work. He'd suggest that Catherine should consider quality of life over quantity, and maybe think about stopping the aggressive interventions. I wanted to strangle him. Here was my wife, fighting for every day she could get with her daughter and grandchildren, and her son-in-law was essentially suggesting she'd be doing everyone a favor by dying sooner rather than later. But Catherine wouldn't hear a word against Derek. She was determined to maintain family harmony, even as she was dying. She made me promise not to confront him about his comments. She said Emma needed Derek's support to get through this difficult time, and causing conflict would only make things harder for everyone. So I kept my mouth shut and watched this parasitic bastard hover around my dying wife like a vulture waiting for a meal. In August 2024, Catherine's condition took a sharp turn for the worse. The cancer had spread to her liver and lungs. Her doctor gently suggested it might be time to consider hospice care. Catherine made the decision to stop treatment and come home to die. Those last 6 weeks were precious and heartbreaking in equal measure. Catherine was lucid most of the time, though increasingly fragile. She spent hours talking with Emma about raising the boys, about maintaining family traditions, about staying connected to the charitable work that had meant so much to both of them. She also spent time talking with me about practical matters: legal documents, financial accounts, the management of Morrison Electronics. Catherine had always handled most of our business affairs, and she was methodical about making sure I understood everything I'd need to know after she was gone. One conversation stands out above all others. Catherine called me into our bedroom on a Thursday afternoon in early September. She was propped up against pillows, looking small and frail, but with her eyes still sharp and intelligent. "Frank," she said, "I need to tell you about the will. I'd assumed I knew the basics. Catherine and I had always planned to leave everything to Emma, with provisions for the boys' education and some charitable bequests. Standard stuff for people in our financial position. But Catherine had made some changes. "I've left everything to you," she said quietly. "All of it. The house, the business, the investments, everything. Emma and the boys are provided for through trust funds that will give them more than enough for comfortable lives, but the bulk of the estate comes to you." I stared at her, confused. Why would she do that? Emma was our only child. It seemed natural that she would inherit her mother's wealth. Catherine's expression was sad but resolved. "I'm worried about Derek, Frank. I've been watching him these past few months and I don't like what I see. If Emma inherits everything now, while she's grieving and vulnerable, I'm afraid Derek will pressure her into decisions she'll regret later." She explained that she'd structured things so that I would have complete control over the family assets for as long as I lived. Emma would receive a substantial annual distribution from the trust funds, more than enough to maintain their current lifestyle, but Derek wouldn't be able to access the principal. "This way," Catherine said, "if Derek shows his true colors after I'm gone, you'll be in a position to protect Emma and the boys. And if he proves me wrong, if he really is the man Emma believes he is, then you can always change the will later." It felt like an enormous responsibility. Catherine was essentially asking me to be the guardian of our family's financial future, to make decisions that would affect our daughter and grandchildren for generations. But looking at my dying wife, seeing the worry in her eyes, I understood why she'd made this choice. Catherine had always been more perceptive about people than I was. If she was concerned about Derek, then those concerns were probably justified. I promised her I'd handle everything according to her wishes. Catherine died on October 12, 2024 at 3:17 in the morning. I was holding her hand. Emma was curled up next to her on the bed. Even Derek was there, though he spent most of those final hours on his phone in the hallway, supposedly handling arrangements. The funeral was beautiful. Catherine had planned most of it herself, choosing readings and music that reflected her values and her love for our family. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects: employees from Morrison Electronics, recipients of our charitable giving, friends from decades of community involvement. Derek delivered a eulogy that made everyone cry. He talked about Catherine's generosity, her wisdom, her devotion to family. He spoke about the privilege of knowing her, the impact she'd had on his life, how much he'd learned from her example. Listening to him speak, I almost felt guilty for my suspicions. Maybe I'd been wrong about Derek all along. Maybe grief and stress had made me paranoid. Maybe Catherine's concerns had been unfounded. That feeling lasted exactly 4 hours. The funeral reception was held at our house. Emma was upstairs lying down, exhausted from the emotion of the day. The boys were with Catherine's sister who'd taken them home early. Most of the guests had left, and I was in the kitchen cleaning glasses when Derek appeared beside me. "We need to talk," he said quietly. I assumed he wanted to discuss Emma's emotional state or arrangements for the boys. I was prepared for a conversation about family logistics, about supporting each other through the grieving process. Instead, Derek grabbed my arm and steered me toward the back porch, away from the remaining guests. "The money's mine now, old man," he whispered, his grip tightening on my forearm. "Sign it over, or I'll make sure you never see your grandchildren again." I stared at him, too shocked to immediately respond. This was my son-in-law, speaking to me at my wife's funeral reception, with her body barely cold in the ground. Derek's mask had finally dropped completely. The charming facade was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating and utterly without conscience. "You heard me," he continued. "Emma's the rightful heir to Catherine's money. I know you think you're protecting her by keeping control, but you're just delaying the inevitable. I am her husband. That money belongs to me, and I'm going to get it one way or another." The shock was giving way to rage. This bastard had spent years circling my family like a predator, and now he thought he could intimidate me into handing over everything Catherine had worked her entire life to build. "Derek," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper, "if you ever threaten me or my family again, I will destroy you." He laughed. actually laughed. "Old man," he said, "you have no idea what you're dealing with. I've been planning for this moment for years. Emma loves me more than she loves you. The boys barely know you exist when I'm around. You think you can keep me away from that money? Watch me." And then he walked away, leaving me standing on my back porch, shaking with fury and disbelief. That was the moment I understood Catherine had been right about everything. Derek Castellano had never loved Emma. He'd never cared about our family except as a means to an end. He'd spent over a decade playing a part, biding his time, waiting for Catherine to die so he could claim what he saw as his prize. Standing there in the aftermath of my wife's funeral, I made a decision that would define everything that happened next. Derek wanted a war. He was going to get one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before I could fight Derek, I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting. The first thing I did was hire a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic, but when someone threatens to keep you away from your grandchildren, you take that seriously. I needed to know who Derek Castellano really was, what resources he had access to, and what he might be capable of doing. The investigator I chose was a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who'd been recommended by our family attorney. Patricia was a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud and domestic investigations. She was thorough, discreet, and expensive, exactly what I needed. I met with Patricia 3 days after the funeral, while Emma was still staying with us and Derek was supposedly back at work handling urgent client matters. I told Patricia everything: Derek's behavior over the years, his financial requests, his threats at the funeral. Patricia listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she asked a single question that cut right to the heart of the matter. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "what exactly do you want to know about your son-in-law?" "Everything," I told her. "His financial background, his employment history, his college records, his family connections." If Derek had been lying about anything, and I suspected he'd been lying about most things, I wanted proof. Patricia's investigation took 6 weeks. What she uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. Derek's trust fund was fictional. His family had never owned a construction business. His grandfather had been a small-time contractor who'd gone bankrupt in the early 1980s, leaving behind debts rather than wealth. Derek's parents, Vincent and Maria Castellano, lived in a modest apartment in Fresno and worked service jobs, Vincent as a night janitor, Maria as a cafeteria worker. They were decent people who'd struggled financially for most of their lives and had no idea their son was claiming to come from money. Derek's expensive lifestyle in college had been funded by credit cards and student loans. He'd graduated with over $200,000 in debt, most of which he'd defaulted on after graduation. His job at the financial services firm was real, but his performance was mediocre at best. Patricia obtained records showing that Derek had been passed over for several promotions and was currently under investigation by his company for potentially steering clients toward high-commission investments that weren't in their best interests. But the most damning discovery was Derek's romantic history. Patricia found evidence of at least 3 serious relationships before Emma, all with women from wealthy families. In each case, Derek had followed the same pattern: charm the woman, integrate himself into her family's financial circle, then pressure for access to money or assets. One relationship had ended when the woman's father had Derek investigated and discovered his lies about his background. Another had ended in a messy breakup involving allegations that Derek had forged the woman's signature on loan applications. The third relationship was the most troubling. Derek had been engaged to a woman named Michelle Hartley, whose family owned a successful restaurant chain in Portland. Michelle had died in a car accident just 6 months before Derek met Emma. Patricia found court records showing that Derek had contested Michelle's will, claiming they'd been married in a private ceremony and that he was entitled to her inheritance. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence, but the pattern was clear. Derek Castellano was a predator who specialized in wealthy women and their families. Armed with Patricia's report, I faced a dilemma. I had proof that Derek was a liar and a manipulator, but Emma was still in love with him. She was also grieving her mother's death and trying to manage 2 young children. How could I destroy her husband's reputation when she was at her most vulnerable? I decided to start with smaller steps. First, I changed all the passwords and access codes for our family's financial accounts. Derek had somehow obtained some of this information over the years, probably from Emma, who'd helped Catherine with administrative tasks and might have inadvertently shared details. Second, I instructed our family attorney to review all legal documents and make sure Derek had no pathway to claiming any portion of Catherine's estate. Third, I started documenting every interaction I had with Derek. If he was planning to escalate his threats, I wanted a paper trail. Derek's response to these defensive measures was swift and predictable. He showed up at my house the following Tuesday, ostensibly to check on how I was handling Emma's grief. Emma was at work and the boys were in school, so Derek and I were alone. "Frank," he said, settling into Catherine's favorite armchair without invitation, "Emma's really worried about you. She thinks you're isolating yourself, making decisions without consulting the family." I was standing in my own living room, looking down at this man who'd threatened me at my wife's funeral, and marveling at his audacity. "What decisions would those be, Derek?" "Well, for instance, she mentioned that you'd changed the passwords on some accounts. That seems unnecessary and potentially confusing for everyone involved." "Those accounts are my responsibility now," I said. "Emma doesn't need access to them." Derek's smile was sharp and cold. "See, that's where I think you're misunderstanding the situation, Frank. Emma is Catherine's daughter. She has a right to understand her mother's financial legacy. And as Emma's husband, I have a responsibility to help her navigate these complex matters." The sheer balls of this guy were almost impressive. He was sitting in my living room, 2 weeks after threatening me, trying to gaslight me into believing that his demand for financial information was motivated by concern for Emma. "Derek," I said slowly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let me be very clear about something. You are not family. You married into this family, which gives you exactly 0 rights to Catherine's money or assets. Emma is provided for through trust funds that will support her and the boys for the rest of their lives. That should be more than sufficient for any reasonable person." Derek's facade cracked slightly. "Any reasonable person," he repeated. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that if you're having financial problems, you should address them through your own efforts, not by pressuring your grieving wife for access to her mother's inheritance." We stared at each other across the living room. The pretense of civility was dissolving, and I could see Derek calculating his next move. "Frank," he said finally, "I think you're going to find that you've overestimated your position here. Emma loves me. The boys love me. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is my influence over this family. You can make this easy on everyone by being reasonable, or you can make it difficult. But either way, I'm going to get what I deserve." "And what is it that you deserve, Derek?" "A fair share of the wealth I've helped this family build, a say in decisions that affect my wife and children, the respect that comes with being an equal partner in this family's future." The delusion was breathtaking. Derek genuinely seemed to believe that marrying Emma entitled him to a portion of money that had been in our family for decades before he'd even met us. "Derek," I said, "you've helped this family build exactly nothing. You've been a financial drain for over a decade. You've contributed nothing of value to Catherine's business or charitable work. You've taken everything we've offered and demanded more. If you think I'm going to reward that behavior by handing over control of my wife's legacy, you're delusional." That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Derek stood up, his face flushing red. "You arrogant bastard," he snarled. "You think because you got lucky and married rich that makes you better than me? I've been carrying this family for years while you played around in your garage. Emma would have been better off without you from day one." The mask was completely off now. This was Derek's true opinion of me, of Catherine, of our entire family. We hadn't been people to him. We'd been resources to be exploited. "I think you should leave," I said quietly. "Oh, I'm leaving," Derek replied, heading toward the door. "But this isn't over, Frank, not even close. You want to play hardball? Let's see how that works out for you." He slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. That evening, Emma called me crying. "Dad," she sobbed, "Derek told me about your conversation today. Why are you being so cruel to him? He's trying to help, and you're treating him like an enemy." My heart broke for my daughter. She genuinely couldn't see what Derek was doing, couldn't understand that his help was actually manipulation designed to serve his own interests. "Emma," I said gently, "I know this is difficult, but Derek and I have different ideas about what's best for our family right now. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to protect Catherine's legacy and make sure you and the boys are taken care of. But Derek is part of this family too," she insisted. "He's my husband and the boy's father. Don't his opinions matter?" "Of course they matter," I lied. "But ultimately, Catherine left these decisions to me because she trusted my judgment. I'm going to honor that trust." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "Dad," she said finally, "I feel like I'm losing my whole family. First Mom, and now you and Derek are fighting, and I don't know how to fix it." The pain in her voice was devastating. Derek's manipulation was working exactly as he'd intended. He was forcing Emma to choose between loyalty to her father and loyalty to her husband. "Honey," I said, "you're not losing me. I will always be here for you and the boys, no matter what happens between Derek and me. But I need you to understand that some of Derek's requests aren't reasonable, and I can't grant them just to keep the peace." "What requests?" Emma asked. That's when I realized Derek hadn't told Emma about his demands for financial control. He'd framed our conflict as a personality clash, not as a disagreement over money. Emma genuinely didn't know that her husband was trying to claim her mother's inheritance. This created an opportunity. If Emma didn't know about Derek's financial demands, maybe she'd be willing to listen to reason about his behavior. But it also created a dilemma. If I told Emma the truth about Derek's threats, she might not believe me. Worse, she might confront Derek about it, which could escalate the situation unpredictably. I decided to take a measured approach. "Emma," I said, "I think Derek is under a lot of financial pressure right now, and that pressure is affecting his judgment. Some of his suggestions about how to handle Catherine's estate aren't in your best interests or the boys' best interests. I'm not trying to cut him out of family decisions, but I also can't make choices that might jeopardize your future security." Emma was quiet again. "Dad," she said finally, "are you saying Derek is trying to take advantage of us?" "I'm saying that people sometimes make poor decisions when they're stressed about money. And I think Derek might be more stressed than he's letting on. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt." Emma was intelligent and perceptive. If she started paying attention to Derek's behavior with fresh eyes, she might begin to see the patterns I'd been noticing for years. Over the next few weeks, Derek's campaign against me intensified. He started calling Emma at work to complain about my unreasonable behavior. He told the boys that Grandpa Frank was being mean to Daddy and that it was making Mommy sad. He enlisted Catherine's sister Diane in his campaign by telling her that I was making unilateral decisions about charitable donations without consulting the rest of the family. Derek was skilled at manipulating situations to make himself appear reasonable and me appear controlling. He'd raise legitimate-sounding concerns about family communication or decision-making processes, and when I defended my actions, I'd come across as defensive and inflexible. But Derek made a crucial mistake that would ultimately be his downfall. He got greedy. In December, about 2 months after Catherine's death, Derek approached Emma with what he called a business opportunity. He'd found an investment property in Napa Valley, a small winery that was struggling financially, but had huge potential for growth. The asking price was $3.2 million, and Derek was convinced he could turn it into a profitable venture within 5 years. Emma came to me with Derek's proposal, excited about the possibility of her husband finally achieving the business success he'd always talked about. She'd already spoken to her bank about liquidating some of her trust fund to provide the capital Derek needed. This was exactly what Catherine had been afraid of. Derek was pressuring Emma to access her inheritance for a high-risk investment that would primarily benefit him. If the winery failed, and most restaurant hospitality businesses do fail, Emma would lose millions of dollars that were supposed to secure her and the boys' futures. I told Emma I needed time to review Derek's business plan before she made any financial commitments. That business plan was a joke. Derek had clearly done minimal research on the wine industry or the specific property he wanted to purchase. His financial projections were wildly optimistic, based on best-case scenarios that ignored market realities, seasonal variations, and operational challenges. More troubling, Derek's proposal showed that he intended to be the sole owner of the winery, with Emma as a silent financial partner. If the business succeeded, Derek would reap most of the benefits. If it failed, Emma would absorb most of the losses. I presented my analysis to Emma as diplomatically as possible, emphasizing the financial risks rather than attacking Derek's competence directly. Emma was disappointed, but agreed that the investment was too risky, given her responsibilities to the boys. When Emma told Derek that she wouldn't be funding the winery purchase, he exploded. Not at Emma, of course. Derek was too smart to alienate her directly. Instead, he focused his rage on me. He stormed into my house on a Saturday afternoon while Emma was grocery shopping with the boys. I was in my workshop tinkering with an old engine when Derek burst through the garage door like he owned the place. "You son of a bitch," he snarled, crossing the garage in 3 quick steps. "You poisoned her against the deal, didn't you?" I looked up from my workbench, taking in Derek's flushed face and clenched fists. He was angrier than I'd ever seen him, and for the first time, I wondered if he might be capable of physical violence. "Derek," I said calmly. Emma made her own decision based on the financial information I provided. "If you have problems with my analysis, we can discuss them like adults. Don't give me that rational bullshit," he snapped. "You've been sabotaging me from day one. You can't stand that Emma chose me over your precious family legacy." Derek was practically vibrating with rage, pacing back and forth in front of my workbench. This was about more than just the winery deal. This was about years of accumulated resentment finally boiling over. "You think you're so smart," he continued, playing the protective father. "But Emma sees right through you. She knows you're trying to control her, trying to keep her dependent on you instead of building a life with her husband." That stung because there was a grain of truth to it. I was trying to protect Emma, but maybe some of my methods were more about maintaining control than I'd admitted to myself. "Derek," I said, "I understand you're frustrated, but attacking me isn't going to solve anything. If you want to discuss Emma's financial decisions, we should include her in the conversation." "Oh, we're way past discussions," Derek said, stopping directly in front of me. "Here's what's going to happen, old man. You're going to call Emma and tell her you made a mistake about the winery deal. You're going to apologize for overstepping your bounds and promise to support her husband's business ventures going forward. And then you're going to start treating me with the respect I deserve as a member of this family." "Or what?" I asked. Derek smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "Or Emma's going to start learning some very interesting things about her dear old dad. Like how you've been investigating her husband behind her back. Like how you've been manipulating her financial decisions to maintain control over her mother's money. Like how you've never respected her choice to marry me and have been working to undermine our marriage from day one." My blood ran cold. Derek had somehow learned about my investigation, and he was threatening to use that information to turn Emma against me. "You see," Derek continued, enjoying my obvious shock, "I'm not the only one who can hire private investigators. I know about Patricia Hendricks. I know about her little report on my background. I know you've been collecting ammunition to use against me." How the hell had Derek found out about Patricia's investigation? I'd been careful about confidentiality, and Patricia was a professional who understood the importance of discretion. Derek must have seen the question in my eyes because he laughed. "You really thought you were being clever, didn't you? Hiring some ex-cop to dig into my past. But here's the thing about private investigators, Frank. They're only as loyal as their last paycheck. And my paycheck was bigger than yours." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Patricia had sold me out to Derek. All the information I'd gathered about his background, all the evidence of his predatory behavior, Derek knew I had it, and he'd probably found ways to discredit or explain away the most damaging revelations. But more importantly, Derek now had proof that I'd been investigating him. If he told Emma about that, she'd see it as the ultimate betrayal of trust. She'd believe Derek's narrative that I was a controlling, manipulative father who couldn't accept her choice of husband. "So here's what we're going to do," Derek said, clearly savoring his advantage. "You're going to be a good father-in-law from now on. You're going to support my business ventures, respect my role in this family, and stop interfering in my marriage. In exchange, I won't tell Emma about your little spy games. Deal?" I stared at this man who'd married my daughter, who'd fathered my grandchildren, who was now blackmailing me in my own garage. The audacity was breathtaking, but I was also calculating. Derek thought he held all the cards, but he'd made a mistake by revealing Patricia's betrayal. If she'd been willing to sell information to Derek, that meant she was corrupt and unreliable. Any report she'd provided to Derek might be as compromised as the one she'd provided to me. More importantly, Derek's threats revealed just how desperate he was becoming. If he'd had legitimate ways to access Catherine's money, he wouldn't need to resort to blackmail. "Deal?" Derek repeated, stepping closer. I looked him in the eye and made a decision that would change everything. "No deal, Derek," I said quietly. "Do whatever you think you need to do. But I'm not going to be intimidated by someone who married my daughter for her money." Derek's face went white with rage. "You stubborn bastard," he hissed. "You have no idea what you're starting." "Actually, Derek," I said, standing up from my workbench, "I know exactly what I'm starting, and I'm looking forward to finishing it." Derek stared at me for a long moment, clearly not expecting this response. He'd anticipated that I'd cave under pressure, that the threat of losing Emma's trust would make me compliant. Instead, I'd essentially declared war. "Fine," Derek said finally, backing toward the garage door. "But when this is over, when Emma realizes what kind of man her father really is, don't come crying to me about losing your family." He left, slamming the door so hard it bounced back open. I stood alone in my garage, surrounded by the tools and projects that had always been my refuge, and realized that Derek was probably right about one thing. Before this was over, I was likely to lose Emma's trust, possibly permanently. But Catherine had asked me to protect our daughter from Derek's manipulation. Even if that protection cost me my relationship with Emma, I was going to honor my wife's wishes. The war had officially begun. Derek's next move was predictable but effective. He told Emma about my investigation, but he was smart about how he revealed the information. Instead of a direct accusation, Derek framed it as a reluctant confession motivated by concern for family unity. Emma called me 2 days after Derek's garage confrontation, crying so hard I could barely understand her words. "Dad," she sobbed, "Derek told me something that can't possibly be true. He said you hired someone to investigate him, to dig up dirt on his background. Please tell me he's lying." The pain in her voice was devastating. This was my daughter, the little girl who'd trusted me completely, who'd always believed I had her best interests at heart. And now, she was asking me to deny something we both knew was true. "Emma," I said carefully, "I was concerned about some of Derek's financial requests after your mother died. I thought it would be prudent to get a better understanding of his background before making any major decisions about the family's assets." "So you did investigate him," Emma said quietly. "You actually hired a private investigator to spy on my husband." "It wasn't spying, honey. It was due diligence. When someone asks for access to significant family assets, it's reasonable to verify their financial credentials and background." "But Derek never asked for access to anything," Emma said, her voice rising. "He offered to help manage Mom's investments, to provide financial planning services. You're the one who made it about money and control." This was Derek's brilliance in action. He'd reframed his demands for financial control as offers to help, making me appear paranoid and controlling for refusing his assistance. "Emma," I said gently, "I need you to think carefully about your interactions with Derek over the past few months. Has he made any comments about feeling entitled to a portion of your mother's inheritance? Has he pressured you to make financial decisions that benefit him more than they benefit you and the boys?" There was a long pause. I could practically hear Emma processing my questions, perhaps remembering conversations or incidents that had seemed innocent at the time but might look different in this new context. "Dad," she said finally, "even if Derek has been frustrated about financial issues, that doesn't justify what you did. You violated his privacy and our trust. How am I supposed to tell my husband that my father thinks so little of him that he had him investigated like a criminal?" The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Emma alternating between hurt, anger, and confusion. She couldn't reconcile the father she'd always trusted with the controlling, suspicious man Derek was describing. I tried to explain my concerns about Derek's financial behavior without revealing the most damaging information from Patricia's investigation. I couldn't tell Emma about Derek's previous relationships with wealthy women without sounding vindictive and petty. I couldn't mention his lies about his family background without admitting how thoroughly I'd violated his privacy. By the end of the call, Emma had extracted a promise that I would apologize to Derek for the investigation and make an effort to rebuild their trust. I had no intention of apologizing to Derek for anything, but I agreed to Emma's request because I needed time to figure out my next move. That night, I sat in my study, surrounded by Catherine's books and photographs, and tried to think like the strategic, principled woman I'd been married to for 4 decades. What would Catherine do in this situation? Catherine had been a master at reading people and situations. She'd built a successful business by understanding human motivation and finding ways to align different interests toward common goals. She'd also been ruthless when necessary, though she'd always maintained a veneer of diplomatic politeness. Catherine would have seen Derek's blackmail attempt as a tactical error that revealed his desperation. She would have recognized that Derek's position was actually weaker than it appeared, despite his temporary advantage with Emma. More importantly, Catherine would have understood that this wasn't really about money. It was about power and control within our family structure. Derek wasn't just trying to access our wealth. He was trying to establish himself as the dominant male figure in Emma's life, replacing me as her primary source of guidance and support. That realization shifted my entire approach to the conflict. Instead of trying to defend myself against Derek's accusations or attempting to expose his lies directly, I needed to create situations where Derek would reveal his true nature to Emma himself. I needed to be patient, strategic, and very, very careful. My first move was to appear to comply with Emma's request for reconciliation, while actually laying groundwork for Derek's eventual downfall. I called Derek and asked him to meet me for lunch at a restaurant near his office. I chose a public place where he'd feel comfortable and confident, where he might be tempted to overplay his hand. Derek arrived 20 minutes late, which I was sure was intentional. He was dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than he could afford on his actual salary, and he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed he'd gained the upper hand in our conflict. "Frank," he said, settling into the booth across from me, "I have to say I'm surprised you called. I wasn't sure you were capable of being reasonable about this situation." I smiled blandly and ordered a beer. "Derek," I said, "Emma asked me to apologize for investigating your background, and she's right. I overstepped, and I'm sorry. I hope we can find a way to move forward that works for everyone." Derek looked suspicious, clearly wondering if this was some kind of trap, but his ego wouldn't let him resist the opportunity to gloat. "Well," he said, "I appreciate the apology. I know this has been difficult for everyone, and I'm glad you're finally ready to approach this situation with maturity." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek genuinely believed he'd won our conflict, that he'd successfully intimidated me into submission. "I'm hoping," Derek continued, "that this means you're ready to reconsider some of my suggestions about managing Catherine's estate. Emma and the boys deserve to benefit from that wealth, and I think I can help maximize their financial security." And there it was, the real agenda, expressed as concern for my daughter and grandchildren. "What kind of suggestions did you have in mind?" I asked innocently. Derek launched into a detailed presentation about investment strategies, tax optimization, and wealth management techniques, that would supposedly benefit our entire family. He spoke with the confidence of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this pitch many times. But as Derek talked, I began to notice inconsistencies in his proposals. He used financial terminology incorrectly, made assumptions about market conditions that revealed his ignorance, and suggested strategies that would primarily benefit him rather than Emma and the boys. More telling, Derek kept referring to our family's wealth and our financial future, unconsciously revealing his belief that marriage to Emma gave him ownership rights over Catherine's inheritance. I listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions that encouraged Derek to elaborate on his ideas. The more he talked, the more apparent his incompetence became. After an hour of Derek's financial presentation, I thanked him for his insights and promised to consider his suggestions carefully. Derek left the lunch believing he'd convinced me to give him a role in managing the family's assets. What he'd actually done was provide me with a recording — I'd worn a small digital recorder throughout our conversation — of himself essentially claiming ownership of Catherine's money and revealing his fundamental misunderstanding of basic financial principles. That recording would be useful later, but my immediate goal was more subtle. Over the next few weeks, I began implementing a strategy designed to reveal Derek's character through his own actions rather than through accusations or investigations. I started by creating opportunities for Derek to demonstrate his greed and entitlement in ways that Emma might notice. For instance, when Emma mentioned that the boys needed new winter coats, I offered to take them shopping as a fun grandfather-grandson activity. Derek immediately insisted on coming along, ostensibly to spend time with his family, but actually to steer the boys toward the most expensive options available. While Emma was distracted by helping Jacob try on jackets, Derek whispered to Michael that Grandpa Frank had lots of money and wouldn't mind buying the fancy coat that cost 3 times as much as what Emma had budgeted. I didn't say anything to Derek about this manipulation, but I made sure Emma overheard his comment. I watched her expression change as she realized her husband was teaching their son to manipulate his grandfather for expensive purchases. Later, when Emma mentioned the incident to Derek, he dismissed her concerns by saying he was just trying to make sure the boys got quality clothing that would last. But I could see that Emma was starting to notice patterns in Derek's behavior that she'd previously overlooked. I created similar situations over the following weeks. Family dinners where Derek would make inappropriate comments about the cost of our house or the value of Catherine's jewelry. Holiday shopping trips where Derek would suggest expensive gifts that were supposedly for the boys, but would actually enhance his own status as a father who could provide luxury items. Each incident was small enough that Derek could explain it away if confronted directly, but collectively, they painted a picture of someone whose thoughts were constantly focused on money and status rather than family relationships. Meanwhile, Derek was making mistakes that I didn't need to orchestrate. His performance at work was deteriorating as he became increasingly distracted by his campaign to access our family's wealth. His supervisor called him into a meeting about missed deadlines and unsatisfied clients. Derek's response was to blame his poor performance on family stress related to his mother-in-law's death, but his excuses were wearing thin. Derek was also spending money he didn't have. His obsession with maintaining the appearance of wealth was leading him to make increasingly risky financial decisions. He'd taken out a second mortgage on his house to fund his lifestyle. He was carrying credit card balances that were approaching his limits. He'd borrowed money from friends and colleagues, always promising to pay them back as soon as he gained access to his inheritance. The pressure was affecting Derek's behavior at home. Emma started mentioning that Derek seemed stressed and irritable, that he was drinking more than usual, that he was having trouble sleeping. But Derek's biggest mistake was underestimating Emma's intelligence and moral compass. In January, 3 months after Catherine's death, Derek presented Emma with another business opportunity. This time it was a real estate development project in Arizona, luxury condos marketed to retirees. Derek wanted Emma to invest $5 million as a limited partner in the development company. Emma brought the proposal to me, but this time she'd done her own research first. She'd looked up the development company online, checked their track record, and even called some of their previous investors. What she'd found was disturbing. The company had a history of projects that went over budget, delayed completion dates, and legal disputes with investors. Several previous developments had been abandoned entirely, leaving investors with total losses. "Dad," Emma said, sitting in my kitchen with Derek's proposal spread across the table, "I think Derek might be getting taken advantage of by these people. This company doesn't look legitimate to me, but he's convinced they're going to make us rich." For the first time since this whole conflict began, Emma was questioning Derek's judgment rather than defending him. "What did Derek say when you shared your research with him?" I asked carefully. Emma's expression was troubled. "He got angry. He said I was being paranoid like you, that I was letting your negative attitude about money-making opportunities influence my thinking. He accused me of not trusting him to make good decisions for our family." That response was so perfectly characteristic of Derek's manipulation tactics that I almost felt bad for how predictable he was. When confronted with legitimate concerns about his proposals, Derek always responded by attacking the questioner's motives rather than addressing the substance of their objections. "Emma," I said gently, "what does your gut tell you about this investment?" My daughter was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers scattered across the table. "Honestly," she said finally, "I think it's a terrible idea, but Derek is so convinced it's going to solve all our financial problems, and he's making me feel guilty for not supporting him." "Financial problems?" I asked. "I thought Derek's job was going well." Emma looked uncomfortable. "He got passed over for another promotion last month," she admitted. "His sales numbers have been down, and I think he's worried about job security. He keeps talking about how we need to build wealth outside of his employment income, how we can't depend on my trust fund forever." This was news to me. Emma's trust fund provided more than enough income to support their family's lifestyle, even without Derek's salary. If Derek was worried about depending on that money, it suggested he was planning for a future where he might not have access to it, possibly because he anticipated Emma discovering his true nature and divorcing him. "Emma," I said, "if Derek is having problems at work, maybe this isn't the best time for him to be making major investment decisions. Financial stress can cloud judgment, even for intelligent people." Emma nodded slowly. "That's what I was thinking," she said. "But Derek sees it differently. He says this is exactly when we need to take calculated risks, when we need to be proactive about building our wealth." The conversation continued for another hour, with Emma working through her conflicted feelings about Derek's pressure to make high-risk investments. For the first time in years, my daughter was talking to me about her marriage problems instead of defending Derek against my concerns. But I was careful not to push too hard. Emma needed to reach her own conclusions about Derek's character and motivations. If I appeared to be manipulating her decision-making, Derek would use that against me to rebuild his credibility with her. Instead, I focused on asking questions that encouraged Emma to trust her own instincts and analyze Derek's behavior objectively. By the end of our conversation, Emma had decided to decline the Arizona investment opportunity. More importantly, she'd started to recognize patterns in Derek's financial requests that suggested his priorities might not align with her and the boys' long-term interests. Derek did not take Emma's refusal well. According to Emma, he accused her of being brainwashed by me, of choosing her father's influence over her husband's expertise. He threatened to find other investors for the Arizona project, claiming that Emma would regret missing out on such a lucrative opportunity. But most tellingly, Derek told Emma that if she wasn't willing to use her mother's money to build their family's wealth, then maybe she didn't deserve to have inherited it in the first place. That comment was Derek's second major tactical error. Emma might have been willing to tolerate criticism of her investment judgment, but she wouldn't tolerate disrespect for her mother's memory or suggestions that she was unworthy of Catherine's love and trust. Emma didn't confront Derek directly about his comment, but she did share it with me. And for the first time since Derek had entered our family, I heard real anger in my daughter's voice when she talked about her husband. "Dad," Emma said, "I'm starting to think Derek sees Mom's money as his money. Like marrying me gave him ownership rights to our family's assets." That was exactly the realization I'd been hoping Emma would reach on her own. Honey, I said carefully, what do you think your mother would say about Derek's attitude toward her inheritance? Emma was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, Mom always worried that people would see me differently because of the money. She made you promise to protect me from anyone who might try to take advantage of our family's wealth. Yes, she did. Do you think Derek is trying to take advantage of us? I looked at my daughter, this intelligent, compassionate woman who was finally beginning to see her husband clearly, and chose my words very carefully. I think Derek is under a lot of pressure right now, and pressure can make people act in ways that don't reflect their best selves. But Emma, you need to trust your instincts about what's best for you and the boys. Your mother left you those trust funds because she wanted you to have financial independence. She wanted you to be able to make choices based on what felt right to you, not based on what other people expected or demanded. Emma nodded slowly. I think I need to talk to Derek about boundaries, she said, about the difference between partnership and control. That conversation between Emma and Derek took place on a Friday night in late January. I don't know exactly what was said, but Derek showed up at my house the next morning looking like he hadn't slept. We need to talk, he said grimly. I invited him into my kitchen and offered coffee, which he declined. Derek sat across from me at the same table where I'd talked with Emma the day before, and I could see that something fundamental had shifted in his demeanor. The cocky confidence was gone, replaced by something closer to desperation. Emma's turning against me, Derek said without preamble, and we both know that's your doing. Derek, I said calmly, Emma is making her own decisions based on her own observations. If she's concerned about your financial proposals, maybe you should listen to those concerns instead of blaming me for her reactions. Don't give me that innocent act, Derek snarled. You've been working to undermine my marriage from day one. Every suggestion I make, every idea I propose, you find ways to make it seem unreasonable or suspicious. Actually, Derek, your ideas have been unreasonable and suspicious. You've proposed 3 different investment opportunities, all of which would primarily benefit you while putting Emma's financial security at risk. You've pressured her to make decisions without proper research or consideration of alternatives, and you've consistently treated her inheritance as if it belonged to you. Derek's face flushed red. That money should belong to me, he said. I'm her husband. I've been part of this family for over a decade. I've earned the right to have a say in how that wealth is managed. And there it was, Derek's true position, stated clearly and without pretense. He genuinely believed that marrying Emma entitled him to ownership of Catherine's money. Derek, I said, you've earned exactly nothing. You married Emma because you loved her, or at least that's what you claimed. That doesn't give you rights to money that was in her family for decades before you met her. Derek stared at me with naked hatred. You think you're so superior, don't you? He said. The noble widower, protecting his family's legacy from the unworthy outsider. But you're just as greedy as I am, Frank. You just hide it better. The accusation stung because there was some truth to it. I was being protective of Catherine's money, and my motives weren't entirely selfless. But the crucial difference was that I was trying to preserve Emma's financial independence, while Derek was trying to eliminate it. Derek, I said, I think this conversation is over. If you have issues with your marriage, you should discuss them with Emma, not with me. Oh, I plan to, Derek replied, standing up abruptly. But first, I want you to understand something. I know about the other investigation. My blood ran cold. What other investigation? Derek smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on a human face. You really thought Patricia Hendricks was the only investigator you could hire? You thought I wouldn't do my own research on the man who's been trying to destroy my marriage? I stared at Derek, trying to process what he was saying. Had he hired someone to investigate me? See, Frank, Derek continued. The problem with throwing stones is that other people have access to the same rocks, and what I've learned about your business dealings over the years is very interesting. Derek pulled a manila folder from his jacket and dropped it on my kitchen table. Take a look, he said. I think you'll find it enlightening. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were financial documents, tax records, business correspondence, all related to Morrison Electronics and our family's charitable activities. But these weren't just random documents. They'd been selected and organized to tell a specific story. A story that made me look like I'd been embezzling from Catherine's charitable foundations for years. The documents were real, but they'd been taken out of context and arranged to suggest financial impropriety that didn't actually exist. Legitimate business expenses had been presented as personal purchases. Reasonable salaries and consulting fees had been characterized as excessive compensation. Strategic investments had been portrayed as risky gambles with charitable funds. Anyone looking at these documents without understanding the full context would conclude that I'd been stealing from the organizations Catherine had worked so hard to build. Derek was watching my face as I reviewed his fabricated case against me. "Interesting reading?" he asked. "I especially like the part about the $200,000 consulting fee you paid yourself last year for strategic planning services. Very creative accounting. That consulting fee had been legitimate payment for work I'd done restructuring one of our charitable programs. The board had approved the payment unanimously, and it had been properly reported to the IRS. But presented without that context, it looked like embezzlement." "Derek," I said slowly, "these documents don't prove anything improper. Every transaction you've highlighted was legal, properly documented, and approved by the appropriate boards or trustees." "Maybe," Derek replied. "But try explaining that to Emma when she discovers that her father has been paying himself hundreds of thousands of dollars from her mother's charitable foundations. Try convincing her that you were acting in the family's best interests when you were actually enriching yourself at the expense of causes Catherine cared about." The beautiful cruelty of Derek's strategy was becoming clear. He'd assembled evidence that was technically accurate but completely misleading. If he presented these documents to Emma, she'd see her father as someone who'd been exploiting her mother's charitable legacy for personal gain. Even worse, Derek's accusations would be much easier for Emma to understand than my accusations against him. Financial fraud looked like straightforward corruption, while Derek's predatory behavior required understanding subtle patterns of manipulation that might not be obvious to someone who loved him. "So here's what's going to happen," Derek said, settling back into his chair like a man who held all the cards. "You're going to stop interfering in my marriage. You're going to support my business ventures and financial proposals. And you're going to treat me with the respect I deserve as Emma's husband and your grandson's father. And if I don't, then Emma gets to see exactly what kind of man her father really is. How he's been stealing from her mother's memory while pretending to protect the family's interests." Derek stood up, straightening his expensive suit jacket. "Think about it, Frank," he said. "You have 24 hours to decide whether you want to be reasonable about this situation." After Derek left, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the folder of documents that could destroy my relationship with Emma and potentially land me in legal trouble if Derek found the right prosecutor. But I was also thinking about Catherine, about the promise I'd made to protect our daughter from exactly this kind of manipulation. Derek had made another tactical error by threatening me directly, instead of simply presenting his fabricated evidence to Emma. His ultimatum revealed that he was still trying to gain control over the family's assets, not just defend himself against my interference. More importantly, Derek's willingness to destroy Emma's relationship with her father in pursuit of financial gain proved that he didn't actually love her. Someone who loved Emma wouldn't deliberately cause her that kind of pain and family trauma. I made a decision that night that would determine everything that happened next. Derek wanted a war. I was going to give him one he'd never forget. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. Derek's ability to compile financial documents that made my legitimate business activities look suspicious suggested he had help from someone with access to confidential records and expertise in financial analysis. I called my attorney, Marcus Webb, and asked him to meet me the next morning. Marcus had been our family's lawyer for 15 years, and he'd helped Catherine structure many of the charitable foundations that Derek was now using against me. Marcus reviewed Derek's folder while I explained the threats and ultimatums. His reaction was immediate and reassuring. "Frank," he said, "these accusations are baseless. Every transaction Derek's highlighted was proper and legal. But I'm concerned about how he obtained these documents. Some of this information should be confidential." That was my concern too. Derek had somehow gained access to internal financial records, tax documents, and board meeting minutes that shouldn't have been available to him. Marcus made some phone calls while I waited in his office. Within an hour, he'd identified the source of the leak. Derek had hired a forensic accountant named Richard Moss, who specialized in divorce cases involving high-net-worth families. Moss had connections with people who could provide financial records through questionable means, and he was skilled at constructing narratives of financial impropriety from legitimate business transactions. The pattern was becoming clear. Derek wasn't just trying to access our family's money. He was preparing for a divorce where he could claim that Emma was entitled to a larger settlement because her father had been mismanaging her inheritance. "Marcus," I said, "I need you to do something that might seem counterintuitive. I want you to schedule a meeting with Derek and his accountant. Tell them I'm ready to negotiate." Marcus looked puzzled. "Frank," he said, "you don't have anything to negotiate about. Derek's accusations are false and his threats constitute blackmail." "I know that," I said, "but Derek doesn't know that I know what he's really planning. If he thinks I'm capitulating to his demands, he might reveal more about his long-term strategy." The meeting was set for the following Wednesday at Marcus's office. Derek brought Richard Moss and another man I didn't recognize, a lawyer named Stephen Caldwell who specialized in family law and asset protection. The presence of a divorce attorney confirmed my suspicions about Derek's ultimate plan. He wasn't just trying to access Catherine's money through Emma. He was preparing to take it through a divorce settlement that would claim I'd been mismanaging the family's assets. Derek opened the meeting with a presentation about how our family could optimize Catherine's estate through better investment strategies and tax planning. He proposed creating a family-limited partnership where he would serve as managing partner, giving him control over investment decisions while providing tax benefits for all family members. It was a sophisticated proposal that would have given Derek exactly what he'd wanted all along: control over Catherine's money with legal protection against future challenges to his authority. But Derek made a crucial mistake during his presentation. He revealed information about our family's financial holdings that he shouldn't have known, including details about offshore accounts and private investment funds that were known only to Catherine, me, and our most trusted advisors. Derek had somehow gained access to information that went far beyond what Richard Moss could have obtained through normal channels. Someone with intimate knowledge of our financial affairs was feeding Derek information. I sat through Derek's presentation without interrupting, occasionally asking questions that encouraged him to reveal more about his sources and methods. Meanwhile, Marcus was taking detailed notes that would later prove invaluable. At the end of the meeting, I told Derek I needed time to consider his proposals. We scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following week, ostensibly to finalize the details of our new partnership. Derek left the meeting believing he'd won. He'd successfully intimidated me into compliance, and now he was going to get everything he'd wanted since the day he'd met Emma. What Derek didn't know was that I'd been recording the entire meeting, and that his presentation had provided me with enough information to identify his inside source and build a criminal case for blackmail and financial fraud. That evening, I called Emma and asked her to meet me for breakfast the next morning. It was time to tell my daughter the truth about her husband, regardless of the consequences for our relationship. Emma arrived at the diner looking tired and stressed. The tension between Derek and me was affecting her health and her ability to function as a mother and professional. "Dad," she said before I could speak, "I don't know how much more of this I can take. Derek is convinced you're trying to destroy our marriage, and you think he's trying to steal Mom's money. I'm caught in the middle, and it's tearing our family apart." I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised to be strong and independent, now exhausted by the conflict between the two most important men in her life. It broke my heart to see what Derek's manipulation had done to her. "Emma," I said gently, "I need to tell you some things that are going to be very difficult to hear. About Derek, about his background, about what he's really been trying to accomplish with our family. I spent the next 2 hours walking Emma through everything I'd discovered about Derek's past, his financial lies, his pattern of targeting wealthy women, and his recent threats and blackmail attempts. I showed her Patricia's original investigation report, the recording of Derek's lunch presentation about managing our family's wealth, and the documents from his meeting with the lawyers. Emma's reactions progressed from disbelief to shock to anger to something approaching devastation. She asked dozens of questions, challenging details, looking for alternative explanations that would preserve her faith in the man she'd married. But the evidence was overwhelming and internally consistent. Derek's behavior over the past 13 years fit a clear pattern of predatory manipulation, designed to gain access to our family's money. The hardest part for Emma to accept was that Derek had never genuinely loved her. He'd seen her as a target from the moment they met, had calculated his way into her heart and her family, had spent over a decade playing a role designed to position himself as Catherine's heir. "Dad?" Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you known about this?" I told her about Catherine's concerns before she died, about her decision to structure the inheritance to protect Emma from exactly this kind of manipulation. I explained that Catherine had seen signs of Derek's true nature that I'd been too trusting to recognize at the time. "Mom knew?" Emma asked, tears streaming down her face. "She knew Derek was using me, and she didn't tell me." "Your mother hoped she was wrong," I said. "She wanted to protect you without destroying your marriage if her concerns were unfounded. That's why she structured things the way she did, to give you time to see Derek clearly while ensuring you and the boys would always be financially secure." Emma was quiet for a long time, processing the magnitude of Derek's betrayal and her mother's prescient protection. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "That," I said, "depends on what you want to happen. Derek doesn't know that you're aware of his true intentions. We can use that advantage to protect you and the boys while ensuring he faces consequences for his actions." Over the next hour, Emma and I developed a plan that would accomplish several objectives: expose Derek's criminal behavior, protect Emma's financial interests, ensure the boys' safety, and give Emma the evidence she'd need for a divorce that would leave Derek with nothing. But first, Emma wanted to confront Derek directly. She needed to hear him admit to his lies and manipulation. She needed closure before she could move forward with ending their marriage. I tried to talk her out of that confrontation. Derek was desperate and potentially dangerous. If he realized Emma knew the truth about his background and intentions, he might become unpredictable. But Emma was adamant. This was her marriage, her life, her decision to make. She was going to confront Derek on her terms and her way at a time and place of her choosing. We agreed that Emma would wear a recording device during her conversation with Derek, and that I would be nearby in case the situation escalated. Emma would confront Derek that evening, after the boys were asleep, in the privacy of their own home. I spent that afternoon in my workshop, trying to distract myself from worrying about Emma's safety. She was a strong, intelligent woman, but Derek had spent 13 years learning how to manipulate her emotions and reactions. Even knowing the truth about him, she might be vulnerable to his psychological manipulation. At 8:30 that evening, Emma texted me that she was ready to begin the conversation with Derek. I drove to their house and parked across the street, close enough to intervene if necessary but far enough away to avoid being detected. Emma had placed multiple recording devices throughout their living room, and she'd arranged for a video call with Marcus Webb that would allow our attorney to witness Derek's admissions in real time. We'd learned from Derek's tactical approach. When this was over, we wanted overwhelming evidence of his crimes and admissions. The confrontation began calmly. Emma told Derek she'd been thinking about their recent financial disagreements and wanted to understand his perspective better. She asked him to explain why he felt entitled to make decisions about her mother's inheritance. Derek initially tried to maintain his usual facade, talking about partnership and shared responsibility within their marriage, but Emma kept pressing, asking more specific questions about his business proposals, his financial background, and his long-term plans for their family's wealth. As Derek realized Emma was asking questions she'd never asked before, his responses became more defensive and eventually more honest. The breakthrough came when Emma asked Derek directly whether he'd married her because he loved her, or because he wanted access to her family's money. Derek's answer was devastating in its honesty. "Both," he said. "I loved you, but I also saw an opportunity to build the kind of life I'd always wanted. Your family's wealth was part of what made you attractive to me. I'm not going to apologize for being practical about marriage and financial security." Emma pressed further, asking about Derek's previous relationships, his lies about his family background, his recent threats against me. Derek's responses revealed the depth of his resentment and entitlement. He admitted that he'd researched Emma's financial situation before asking her out. He acknowledged that he'd lied about his trust fund and family background because he knew Emma wouldn't have been interested in dating someone from his actual socioeconomic background. Most damning, Derek admitted that he'd hired investigators to dig up information about me that could be used to force my cooperation with his financial plans. "You want to know the truth, Emma?" Derek said, his voice rising with frustration. "Your father has been standing between me and the life I deserve for over a decade. I've put up with his condescension and suspicion. I've played the grateful son-in-law. I've pretended to respect his authority over money that should rightfully belong to our family. But I'm done with that game." Derek went on to describe his plans for gaining control over Catherine's estate, including his strategy for using fabricated evidence of financial impropriety to force me into compliance. The most chilling part of Derek's confession was his attitude toward Emma and the boys. He spoke about them as assets to be managed rather than people to be loved. Emma was his pathway to wealth, and the boys were leverage he could use to ensure her cooperation with his financial plans. When Emma asked Derek whether he would actually try to keep the boys away from me if I didn't cooperate with his demands, his response was coldly pragmatic. "Whatever it takes, Emma. Your father needs to understand that I'm not going anywhere and that I'm going to get what I've earned through 13 years of marriage to his daughter." That statement sealed Derek's fate. He'd admitted to marrying Emma under false pretenses, lying about his background, attempting blackmail, and threatening to use his children as weapons in a financial dispute. Emma ended the conversation by telling Derek she needed time to think about everything he'd said. Derek, still believing he'd successfully manipulated the situation, agreed to give her space to process his honesty about their marriage and financial situation. The next morning, Emma filed for divorce. She also filed for a restraining order based on Derek's threats against me and his admission that he'd been planning to use the boys as leverage in financial negotiations. Marcus Webb simultaneously filed criminal complaints for blackmail, attempted fraud, and conspiracy based on Derek's recorded admissions and his collaboration with Richard Moss to fabricate evidence against me. Derek's response was swift and predictable. He hired an expensive divorce attorney and began a campaign to portray himself as the victim of a wealthy family's conspiracy to destroy him. But Derek had made too many tactical errors. His recorded admissions were devastating evidence of his true character and intentions. His collaboration with Richard Moss had left a paper trail of attempted fraud that prosecutors found compelling. His threats against me and the boys had been witnessed by multiple people and documented in various recordings. More importantly, Emma's testimony about Derek's pattern of manipulation and financial pressure provided context that made his criminal behavior appear systemic rather than situational. The divorce proceedings were brutal but brief. Derek had no legitimate claim to Catherine's inheritance, and his attempts to argue for substantial alimony were undermined by evidence of his fraudulent behavior throughout the marriage. Derek's criminal trials took longer, but the outcomes were never really in doubt. He was convicted on multiple counts of attempted fraud, blackmail, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution for the legal costs his victims had incurred. Richard Moss, the forensic accountant who'd helped Derek fabricate evidence against me, was convicted of conspiracy and fraud. He lost his professional licenses and served 2 years in prison. Stephen Caldwell, Derek's divorce attorney, escaped criminal charges but faced professional sanctions for his role in Derek's schemes. The investigation also revealed that Derek had been embezzling from his employer for over 2 years, stealing client funds to support his expensive lifestyle while waiting for access to Catherine's money. Those crimes added another 3 years to his prison sentence, but the most satisfying outcome wasn't Derek's imprisonment. It was watching Emma reclaim her strength and independence. The divorce was finalized 6 months after Emma's confrontation with Derek. She received full custody of the boys, with Derek's visitation rights severely limited due to his criminal convictions and history of using the children as leverage in adult conflicts. Emma sold the house she'd shared with Derek and bought a smaller place closer to me, saying she wanted the boys to have a strong relationship with their grandfather during the difficult transition period. She also became more involved with Morrison Electronics and our family's charitable work, bringing fresh energy and perspectives to organizations that had been Catherine's passion. Most importantly, Emma began dating again, this time with the wisdom that comes from understanding how predators operate and the confidence that comes from financial independence. 6 months after Derek's conviction, Emma met a teacher named Paul Richardson at one of the boys' soccer games. Paul was a widower with a daughter of his own, someone who understood the complexities of single parenthood and the importance of building relationships on mutual respect rather than financial opportunity. Paul had no idea about our family's wealth when he asked Emma out. He was interested in the smart, funny, compassionate woman he'd met, not in her financial situation. When Emma eventually told him about our family's assets, Paul's reaction was concern rather than excitement. He worried about how the money might complicate their relationship and affect their children's development. That response told Emma everything she needed to know about Paul's character and intentions. Emma and Paul married 2 years after Derek's conviction, in a small ceremony that focused on blending their families rather than displaying wealth. Catherine would have loved him. Paul brought out Emma's natural joy and helped her remember what healthy love looked like. Derek served 3 years of his 4-year sentence before being released on parole. I wasn't notified of his release, a bureaucratic oversight that probably saved Derek from making another serious mistake. He showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening in March, 2 months after getting out of prison. I was in my workshop when I heard someone pounding on my front door with enough force to rattle the windows. I opened the door to find Derek standing on my porch, looking like prison had not been kind to him. He was thinner, harder, with the kind of anger in his eyes that comes from years of nursing grievances in a small cell. "Frank," he said, pushing past me into my living room without invitation. "We need to finish our conversation." I'd been expecting this visit ever since I'd learned about Derek's parole. Men like Derek don't accept responsibility for their failures. They blame others and seek revenge against anyone they hold responsible for their downfall. "Derek," I said calmly, "you're violating the terms of your restraining order by being here. I'm going to ask you to leave, and then I'm going to call the police." Derek laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The police?" he said. "You think I'm afraid of going back to prison? You think I have anything left to lose?" That statement told me everything I needed to know about Derek's mental state and intentions. He wasn't here to apologize or seek reconciliation. He was here for revenge, and he'd already decided that the consequences didn't matter. I reached for my phone to call 911, but Derek was faster than I'd anticipated. He grabbed my wrist and squeezed hard enough to make me drop the phone. "You destroyed my life, old man," Derek said, his voice low and dangerous. "You turned my wife against me, took my children away, sent me to prison, ruined any chance I had at building the life I deserved." "Derek," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I didn't destroy your life. You did that yourself when you chose to lie, manipulate, and threaten the people who should have been able to trust you." That response was apparently the wrong thing to say. Derek's grip tightened on my wrist, and I could see him calculating whether physical violence would provide the satisfaction he was seeking. I was 70 years old, alone in my house with a man who'd spent 3 years in prison building resentment against me. Derek was younger, stronger, and had nothing to lose. If this situation escalated to violence, I was unlikely to survive it. But I was also thinking about Catherine, about the promise I'd made to protect our family from people like Derek. Even if it cost me my life, I wasn't going to let this predator threaten Emma or the boys ever again. Derek, I said, looking him directly in the eye. Emma is happy now. She's remarried to a good man who loves her and the boys. She's building the kind of life your mother would have wanted for her. If you have any genuine feelings for your children, you'll leave them alone to build healthy relationships with their new stepfather. Wrong answer again. Derek released my wrist and stepped back, his expression shifting to something cold and calculating. You really think this is over, don't you? He said. You think because I went to prison because Emma divorced me, because you managed to turn everyone against me, that you've won some kind of victory. Derek began pacing around my living room, touching Catherine's photographs and personal items with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. But here's what you don't understand, Frank, he continued. Prison gives you a lot of time to think, to plan, to consider all the ways you might get revenge against the people who wronged you. Derek picked up a framed photograph of Catherine and me from our wedding day, studying it with an expression that made my blood run cold. You took everything from me, he said quietly. My wife, my children, my freedom, my future. So now I'm going to take everything from you. Derek set the photograph down and turned to face me directly. Emma thinks she's safe because she has that restraining order, because Paul the teacher is going to protect her, because you're watching out for your precious family. But restraining orders are just pieces of paper, Frank, and old men die from heart attacks and accidents all the time. The threat was clear and specific. Derek was planning to hurt Emma, Paul, possibly the boys, and he was planning to kill me. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the moment Catherine had been preparing me for when she'd asked me to protect our family. Derek had finally revealed his true nature completely, and now I knew exactly what needed to be done. Derek, I said quietly, I want you to understand something. The investigation that sent you to prison the first time, that was just the beginning. While you were locked up, I've been working with law enforcement to build cases against other people who prey on wealthy families the way you preyed on ours. Derek's expression shifted slightly, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. You see, I continued, your case wasn't isolated. There are dozens of men like you operating in California alone, and they all follow similar patterns. Law enforcement has been very interested in those patterns, especially when they're explained by someone with intimate knowledge of how the schemes work. I was lying, of course. I hadn't been working with law enforcement on any broader investigation. But Derek had spent 3 years in prison hearing stories from other criminals, and he knew that cooperation with authorities was one way to reduce sentences and gain protection. Derek, I said, taking a step closer to him, you're not the only predator I've exposed. And the others? They know you were the one whose case opened up all the other investigations. They know you're responsible for law enforcement taking a closer look at their operations. The lie was working. Derek's confidence was cracking as he considered the possibility that he'd made enemies in prison who blamed him for broader law enforcement attention to financial predators. So here's what's going to happen, I continued. You're going to walk out of my house, get in whatever car brought you here, and disappear. Because if anything happens to me, to Emma, to Paul, or to those boys, the first person the police are going to look at is the ex-convict who's already threatened all of us. Derek stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to determine whether I was bluffing. And if you think you can be subtle about it, I added, remember that Emma has a new husband who's going to notice if she starts acting scared or stressed. Paul Richardson is a good man who loves his family, and he's not going to ignore signs that someone is threatening them. I pulled out my phone and showed Derek that I'd already dialed 911, with my finger hovering over the call button. You have 30 seconds to decide, Derek. Walk away now. Or explain to the police why you're violating your restraining order and threatening a 70-year-old man in his own home. Derek looked at me, at the phone, at the photographs of my family that surrounded us in the living room. I could see him calculating odds, weighing risks, considering alternatives. Finally, he smiled that cold, calculating smile I remembered from our first confrontation in the garage. This isn't over, Frank, he said. It's never going to be over. Then Derek walked out of my house, got into a beat-up Honda Civic parked in my driveway, and drove away. I waited until his taillights disappeared before I called the police to report the restraining order violation. Then I called Emma to warn her that Derek had been released from prison and was making threats. The police took my report seriously, especially given Derek's criminal history and the specific nature of his threats. They issued a warrant for his arrest based on the restraining order violation and put out a BOLO alert for his vehicle. But Derek had vanished. For 2 weeks, I lived with the constant anxiety that Derek might be planning something terrible. I hired private security to watch Emma and Paul's house. I varied my routines and avoided predictable schedules. I checked in with Emma multiple times each day to make sure she and the boys were safe. Then I got a call from a detective in Nevada. Derek had been found dead in a motel room outside Las Vegas, apparently from a drug overdose. The circumstances were suspicious. Derek had no known history of drug use, and the amount of heroin found in his system suggested either a deliberate overdose or foul play. The detective wanted to know if I had any information about Derek's state of mind or his activities since being released from prison. I told him about Derek's visit to my house, his threats, and his apparent desperation about his inability to rebuild his life. The detective thanked me for the information and said the case would probably be closed as a suicide unless additional evidence suggested otherwise. I never found out exactly what happened to Derek Castellano in that Nevada motel room. Maybe he'd been telling the truth about having nothing left to lose, and he'd decided to end his life rather than face the consequences of violating his parole. Maybe he'd gotten involved with dangerous people who'd decided he was a liability. Or maybe Derek had encountered another predator more skilled and ruthless than himself. I didn't really care. Derek had made his choices, and those choices had led him to a predictable end. The important thing was that Emma and the boys were safe, and Derek would never be able to threaten our family again. 5 years have passed since Derek's death. Emma and Paul have been married for 3 years now, and their blended family has become something beautiful to watch. Jacob and Michael, now 14 years old, have adapted well to having Paul as a stepfather. Paul never tried to replace Derek in their lives. Instead, he focused on being present, consistent, and supportive in ways their biological father never was. The boys still ask about Derek sometimes. Emma and I have been honest with them about his crimes and the reasons for their parents' divorce. But we've tried to frame those conversations in age-appropriate ways that don't traumatize them or make them feel responsible for their father's choices. Jacob has inherited Catherine's entrepreneurial instincts and has started a small business tutoring younger students in mathematics. Michael has his mother's compassion and volunteers at the animal shelter where Catherine used to work. Both boys understand that they're fortunate to come from a family with financial resources, but they also understand that wealth comes with responsibilities. They've been involved in our charitable work since they were young, and they've seen firsthand how money can be used to make positive differences in other people's lives. Emma has become the CEO of Morrison Electronics, bringing the company into new markets while maintaining its commitment to supporting underserved communities. She's also expanded our family's charitable giving, particularly in areas related to financial literacy and helping young women avoid predatory relationships. Paul has proven to be everything Derek pretended to be, a loving husband and father who prioritizes family relationships over financial gain. He's never shown any interest in controlling or accessing our family's wealth, and he's been supportive of Emma's work with our various business and charitable enterprises. Most importantly, Emma has recovered the joy and confidence that Derek's manipulation had slowly eroded over 13 years. She laughs again, that same uninhibited sound that made me fall in love with her mother. She trusts her own instincts about people and situations. She's built a life based on her own values, rather than someone else's expectations or demands. As for me, I'm 72 years old now, and acutely aware that I won't be around forever to protect the legacy Catherine and I built together. But I'm not worried about the future of our family's wealth or values. Emma has proven that she can recognize and resist manipulation. She's chosen a partner who shares her commitment to using resources responsibly. She's raising boys who understand both the privileges and obligations that come with inherited wealth. The trust funds Catherine established We'll provide for Emma and the boys regardless of what happens to me or to the broader economy. The charitable foundations will continue their work long after I'm gone. Morrison Electronics will keep supporting communities and causes that matter to our family. But more than the money or the businesses, what I'm most proud of is the character our family has maintained through everything Derek put us through. We could have responded to Derek's predatory behavior with cynicism, closing ourselves off from new relationships and viewing everyone as a potential threat. Instead, Emma found the courage to love again, and she chose someone who valued her for who she was rather than what she owned. We could have let Derek's manipulation turn us against each other, allowing his divide-and-conquer tactics to permanently damage our family relationships. Instead, we learned to communicate more honestly and support each other through difficult decisions. We could have used our wealth and legal resources to destroy Derek more completely, pursuing every possible criminal charge and civil penalty. Instead, we focused on protecting our family and ensuring Derek faced appropriate consequences for his actions. Catherine would be proud of how we handled the Derek situation. She'd be proud of Emma's strength and resilience. She'd be proud of the men Jacob and Michael are becoming. She'd be proud that our family's values survived the test of dealing with someone who had no values at all. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in my study surrounded by Catherine's books and photographs, and I think about what she taught me about protecting the people you love. It's not about the money, though money can be a tool for protection or destruction depending on how it's used. It's not about power, though sometimes you need power to defend against those who would abuse it. It's about understanding that love requires vigilance, that trust must be earned and verified, and that family loyalty means protecting each other from threats both obvious and subtle. Derek Castellano spent 13 years of his life planning to steal from our family. He lied, manipulated, and threatened. He was willing to destroy a marriage, traumatize children, and commit multiple crimes in pursuit of money he'd never earned. In the end, Derek died alone in a cheap motel room, broke and friendless, having accomplished nothing except his own destruction. Meanwhile, our family grew stronger, wiser, and more united. We learned valuable lessons about trust and vigilance. We deepened our commitment to using our resources responsibly. We built new relationships based on genuine love and mutual respect. That's the difference between people who see wealth as an opportunity to serve others and people who see it as something to be taken for personal gain. Derek thought he was smart enough to manipulate our family for his own benefit. But he never understood that real strength comes from caring about other people more than you care about money. Catherine understood that. Emma understands it now. Jacob and Michael are learning it. And that understanding, not the money, not the business, not the houses or investments, that's the real inheritance Catherine left for our family. If you've ever dealt with someone who tried to manipulate or exploit your trust, you know how important it is to recognize the warning signs before they can cause permanent damage. Derek's story isn't unique. There are predators out there right now targeting vulnerable people in every community and economic class. They're skilled at finding people who are grieving, lonely, or desperate for love and acceptance. They're patient, charming, and willing to invest years in gaining access to their victims' resources or emotions. But they all make the same fundamental mistake Derek made. They assume that other people are as selfish and calculating as they are. They can't imagine genuine love or loyalty or principles that can't be bought or manipulated. That's their weakness. And if you know what to look for, it's how you can protect yourself and the people you care about from becoming their next victims. Watch for people who are too interested in your financial situation too quickly. Be suspicious of anyone who tries to isolate you from family and friends who care about your well-being. Pay attention to the difference between someone who wants to build something with you and someone who wants to take something from you. Most importantly, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about a person or a relationship, investigate that feeling instead of dismissing it. Catherine's instincts about Derek were right from the beginning. If we'd trusted them sooner, we might have avoided years of manipulation and conflict. The money Derek tried so hard to steal? It's still in our family, still being used to support causes and communities that matter to us. But more importantly, the values that money represents, generosity, responsibility, love for family, commitment to making the world better. Those values survived Derek's attack and continue to guide how we live our lives. In the end, that's what real wealth looks like. Not numbers in bank accounts or properties on tax rolls, but the knowledge that you've used whatever resources you have to protect the people you love and serve, purposes bigger than yourself. Derek Castellano never understood that kind of wealth, which is why he died with nothing despite all his schemes and manipulations. Our family understands it, which is why we'll continue to prosper long after Derek's name is forgotten. And that, more than any revenge I could have planned, is the perfect ending to this story. Catherine's legacy is secure. Emma's future is bright. The boys are growing up with strong values and loving guidance. Our family is stronger and wiser than it was before Derek entered our lives. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemy. It's building something so good, so strong, so meaningful that their attacks only make you more grateful for what you have. If you've made it this far in my story, I hope you'll take a moment to think about your own family, your own relationships, your own vulnerabilities to people who might try to take advantage of your trust and generosity. And if this story helped you recognize warning signs or gave you courage to protect yourself from manipulation, then please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because the best way to honor Catherine's memory isn't just protecting our own family, it's helping other families avoid the pain Derek tried to inflict on ours. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe if you want to hear more about how ordinary families can protect themselves from extraordinary predators, and leave a comment about your own experiences with people who turned out to be different than they seemed. Because in the end, we're all stronger when we share our stories and look out for each other. Thanks for listening. And remember, trust, but verify. Love, but protect. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.